They did not give humanity a seat at the galactic table because humanity earned one. They gave humanity a seat because refusing to would have looked cruel on the historical record, and the Cordevi Assembly has never once, in 11,000 years, allowed itself to look cruel on the historical record. The chair they gave humanity had no vote attached to it. It faced the wall. It was, according to the official transcript, a courtesy extended to a species that statistically should not exist. The insult arrived translated into English, and the translation made it worse. The seating protocol document described humanity as an outlier population of persistent biological improbability, granted non-participatory observer status in recognition of survival against expected extinction variants. Attached to the document was a chart. 5 red lines marked 5 extinction-class events humanity had lived through in the last 100,000 years, each line annotated with a probability of survival so low that the Assembly's own statisticians had flagged it as a rounding error worth investigating rather than an achievement worth respecting. The document specified the chair's material as reclaimed hull plating, non-structural grade. Because the Assembly had not budgeted for a species, it did not expect to still be attending sessions by the time the plating needed replacing. Ambassador Threll of the Cordevi Assembly delivered the seating personally, in perfect, unaccented English, smiling the way a teacher smiles at a student who has failed upward. He had learned the language, he mentioned in passing, from recordings the Assembly had collected over 4 decades of unbroadcast observation, a fact he offered as a compliment and the delegation received as a confession. "We have set a chair for you," he said, "so that in another few centuries, when you understand what a seat at this table actually means, you will not have to ask twice." Behind him, 2 junior attaches carried the chair itself into the gallery on a transport frame, still bearing a manufacturing tag that read, in Assembly script, and then in a hasty English translation stapled beneath it, decommissioned, NON structural reclamation grade. Nobody on the Earth delegation asked what the chair had been reclaimed from. The delegation from Earth sat in silence in the observation gallery afterward. Dr. Kavya Anand did not. Dr. Kavya Anand, a woman whose faculty page had listed her research interest for 11 years as extinction epidemiology, a field that did not officially exist until the funding committee finally admitted the chart could not be argued with, held the newly created chair at the Terran Survival Institute. She had spent 11 years arguing that humanity's repeated survival of extinction-class events was not luck, that the pattern itself was data worth building a career on, and she had been quietly removed from 2 academic panels for saying so out loud in rooms that preferred their explanations tidier. She read the seating chart twice, then looked up. "They handed us a probability distribution," she said, "and called it an insult. I want the full extinction record, every event. Every gap in the fossil and genetic timeline where we should have ended and did not." It was not a rallying line. It was a request for files, delivered flatly, and it was the moment everything after it became inevitable. The discovery began in the Institute's basement archive, because that was the only room with servers large enough to hold the compiled climate, genetic, and geological datasets the Assembly had unknowingly handed over as part of the seating documentation. Attached as a courtesy, nobody at the Assembly had expected anyone to actually read closely. Dr. Marcus Bonsu, a paleogeneticist who had spent 6 years being told his thesis on convergent survival adaptation was statistically unserious. A phrase he had since had printed on a coffee mug he kept on his desk without irony, was the first to stop talking mid-sentence and sit down on the concrete floor, because his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him up. He had cross-referenced the Assembly's own extinction probability model against humanity's actual genetic bottleneck data, and the model did not just describe humanity's survival as improbable. It described the adaptive mutation rate required to survive 4 of the 5 events, as a rate the Assembly's own biology considered evolutionarily unstable. A rate no species in the Assembly's 11,000-year record had ever sustained across multiple consecutive extinction events, without becoming something else entirely. Bonsu did not stand back up for 11 minutes. When he did, he said only one sentence. "We didn't get lucky 5 times, we got fast." He spent the rest of the afternoon rebuilding the mutation rate model from scratch because the first result felt too clean to trust, and the second result matched the first to 3 decimal places. He ran it a 3rd time against a dataset he had deliberately corrupted by 5%, expecting the anomaly to wash out under noise the way every honest anomaly eventually does. It did not wash out. It got sharper because the underlying pattern was strong enough to survive contamination that would have erased a weaker signal entirely, and that, more than the original number, was what convinced him the finding was real. Dr. Hannah Park, a systems modeler who had once been asked, in a peer review she still kept printed and framed above her monitor, whether she had confused resilience with statistical noise. Owned the second discovery, and she reached it 3 days later, because Bonsu's genetic timeline had given her something to model against. She built a simulation of humanity's adaptive response curve across all 5 extinction events, and ran it against the standard assembly civilizational collapse model, the same model used to certify every other species currently seated at the table. The human curve did not match any of them. It did not spike after a disaster and slowly recover to baseline, the pattern every certified species showed without exception. It compounded instead, each survived event making the next one statistically more survivable rather than resetting the risk back to zero. A pattern the Assembly's own literature had a formal name for and had only ever observed in theoretical projections, never in a confirmed biological population across 5 separate events. Park went quiet for a long moment before she spoke, because she needed the silence to make sure she was reading the output correctly and not simply seeing what she wanted to see. "This isn't a species that survives extinction events," she finally said. "This is a species built to get stronger from them. Nobody on the Assembly's chair list has ever certified that pattern as real, because certifying it changes the entire seating structure underneath everyone already sitting there." She printed the curve on paper, an old habit from a mentor who had never trusted a result until it existed outside a screen, and pinned it to the wall of the basement archive next to Bonsu's mutation rate tables, where it stayed for the rest of the 11 days. The 2 findings sitting side by side like 2 halves of a single argument nobody at the table had been allowed to hear yet. Between Bonsu's finding and Park's, the basement archive went through 3 days that none of them later described as calm. Bonsu cross-checked his mutation model against every extinction dataset the Institute had ever compiled, including 2 he had personally dismissed years earlier as incomplete, and found the pattern held in both. Park's early simulation runs kept failing to converge, not because the model was wrong, but because the compounding curve produced numbers her software's error handling had been written to reject as physically implausible. And she spent a full day rewriting the tolerance thresholds before the program would even let her see the output it had already calculated. Anand spent those 3 days doing the part of the work nobody photographed for the eventual documentary, reading 11,000 years of assembly seating precedent 1 clause at a time, because she had learned, over 11 years of being dismissed, that the people who win arguments against institutions are rarely the ones with the better facts. They are the ones who have actually read the institution's own rules. Dr. Anand owned the 3rd discovery, and it was the one that mattered least in isolation and most in combination with the other 2, because she was the one who understood what the pattern meant procedurally rather than biologically. Assembly law, buried in a seating charter nobody outside the Assembly's own archivists had ever been required to read in full, stated that any species demonstrating what the charter called compounding survival adaptation, beyond a defined statistical threshold, was owed automatic reclassification from observer to provisional voting status. A clause written 11,000 years earlier for a hypothetical species that had never actually existed. It had never been triggered. It had never needed to be. Anand read it twice, then read the seating chart Threll had personally handed the delegation, and understood with the particular quiet of someone realizing they are standing on solid ground they had not known was there, that the Assembly had handed humanity the exact document proving humanity did not belong in the chair facing the wall. They had 11 days to file the reclassification claim before the seating window closed for another Assembly cycle, and on day 6, the Cull Concord moved first. The Cull Concord was a bloc within the Assembly that had opposed seating humanity at all, arguing that observer status was already a generosity the species had not earned, and their formal communication arrived with the particular devastating politeness of a body that had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of saying no without ever raising its voice. The Concord finds the proposed reclassification procedurally irregular and biologically unverified, the message read, and requests suspension of the human delegation's archival privileges pending a full review, a process the Concord notes typically requires between 4 and 6 standard years. Attached to the message unofficially was something the formal channel did not mention. 3 Concord verification vessels had entered orbital range of the Institute's primary data relay, positioned not to attack, but to make clear that the Concord could sever the delegation's access to the very archive proving its own case, and would, unless the claim was quietly withdrawn before the window opened. Anand's response to the deadline was not fear, it was acceleration, and it was short. "If they can cut our access in 4 days," she said, "then we don't file in 11, we file in 3. Bonsu did not sleep for the next 40 hours, because sleeping meant trusting that the relay would still be intact when he woke up, and he had stopped being willing to make that assumption. Park rebuilt the compounding curve visualization twice more, tightening the confidence intervals until the Concord's own review board would have nothing left to dispute on statistical grounds alone, because she understood that a claim filed under threat would be scrutinized harder than one filed at leisure, and she intended to hand the Assembly a result with no seams in it. Anand spent the same 40 hours drafting the reclassification filing itself in triplicate, one copy written in the Assembly's formal procedural language, one copy written for the Institute's own legal record, and one copy written in plain English for no audience but herself, because she wanted a version that said exactly what had happened without the translation softening any of it. Nobody in the basement said the word deadline again. There was no time to spend on saying it. The 3 Concord vessels moved to jamming range at 600 on the 11th day, the exact hour the reclassification window opened, and the Concord's plan was simple. Sever the relay before the claim could be formally logged, then argue afterward that the claim had never been properly filed at all. It worked for 40 seconds. The Concord had assumed the delegation's data would route through the Institute's single sanction relay, because every other seeded species routed through a single sanction channel, and every other seeded species had built its systems the way the Assembly expected systems to be built. Bonsu had spent the previous 40 hours doing something the Concord had no model for. He had fragmented the reclassification claim across 11 independent low-bandwidth backup channels, each one disguised as routine climate telemetry, a redundancy method humanity had developed out of necessity during its own extinction events, and had never once thought to mention to anyone outside the species, because it had never occurred to anyone that it was worth mentioning. The jamming closed one channel, then a second, 10 channels held. 3 of them ran through commercial weather monitoring frequencies the Concord had no jurisdiction to disrupt without triggering a separate treaty violation, a detail Bonsu had built into the routing specifically because he had read the Concord's own charter closely enough to know exactly which channels they could not legally touch without exposing themselves first. The claim logged at 6:01, 40 seconds after the window opened, verified, and timestamped, before the 3rd vessel finished repositioning to widen the jamming field. One Concord ship broke formation and withdrew without firing. Its commander had watched the jamming fail against a redundancy pattern no Assembly species had ever needed to build in 11,000 years, and recognized in that failure exactly what kind of species the Concord was now facing. He chose not to be the officer remembered for testing that pattern further. The confrontation lasted 11 minutes. No shots were fired. 2 Concord vessels held position for another 19 minutes after the 3rd withdrew, running a secondary jamming sweep against channels that no longer carried anything worth intercepting, a gesture Anand later described as procedural stubbornness rather than strategy. The claim survived intact, logged, timestamped, unassailable, cross-verified across all 10 surviving channels within the hour. Ambassador Threll's personal transmission arrived 4 hours later, on a private channel not the official diplomatic one, and it opened with 11 seconds of silence before he spoke. "I did not expect this," he said, and the words came slower than his practiced English usually allowed, "and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I did not expect the redundancy. I did not expect the speed. I built your seeding protocol, assuming a species that survives by accident does not plan for interruption, because no species in 11,000 years of our record has ever needed to. That was an audacious assumption on my part, and it was wrong in exactly the way that matters most." He did not apologize for the chair facing the wall. He did something the Concord never would have done. He asked plainly what the reclassification would now require of the Assembly's own charter, which was, Anand noted later, the closest thing to respect the table had ever offered anyone seated at it. The reclassification hearing granted humanity provisional voting status 41 hours after the claim logged, the fastest reclassification in the Assembly's recorded history, and the new chair faced the room instead of the wall. Anand did not attend the ceremony. She was 3 floors below it, in the same basement archive where Bonsu had sat down on the concrete floor 11 days earlier, drafting the next filing, a formal request for the Assembly's full historical extinction response dataset across every species the table had ever seeded, rejected, or quietly stopped tracking. Park found her there an hour after the vote and asked why she was not upstairs for the ceremony. Anand did not look up from the console. "They handed us a chart proving we survive extinction better than anyone at that table," she said, "and I want to know how many other species they measured the same way and never told." The chair was never the point. The data was always the point, and were the only species at that table who's ever had to know it. Somewhere above them, the Assembly was still arguing procedural language about the vote. Below them, the next filing was already 40% complete, and Bonsu had already started pulling the archive for species number 2. The new chair arrived at the Institute 3 weeks later, shipped without ceremony, its manufacturing tag replaced with a plain metal plate that carried no reclamation grade and no disposal category. Only a seat number in the assembly's own numbering system, the same system used for every permanent chair at the table. Anand had it placed in the basement archive instead of the gallery upstairs, next to the printed curve still pinned to the wall, because she said the room that had done the actual work deserved to keep the only proof anyone had bothered to give them. Threll's office requested, 6 months later, formal permission to cite the Institute's redundancy architecture in the Assembly's own emergency communications standard, a request Anand approved in 11 words and did not attend the signing for. She was already 3 floors down, reading extinction data for a species the Assembly had stopped tracking 4,000 years earlier, and the lights in the basement stayed on long after the ceremony upstairs had ended. The chair faced forward. The chair faced forward.